at 40.5 shillings over the day, totaling to about 422 million shillings. For that, look out for the market statistics that will be showing and airing after this show. For now, we go back to the conversation about politics and the economy, who influences who. Eugene, who's a senior associate at Africa Practice, is helping us with that conversation. Eugene, before we took a break, we were just discussing the legislative process and understanding what committees are of interest and how do they influence some of the key things that an investor needs to pay attention to.
Well, the committees of interest to you will depend on what sector you're in.
Okay.
Because there's departmental committees which oversee various sectors of government and thus the economy.
Okay.
But the obvious big one is the Budget and Appropriations Committee, because they're the guys who approve the budget and taxes and that sort of thing.
Are they put it once a year, or do you need to keep tabs on what's happening in that committee?
Well, the budget process is actually quite a long and involved process,
yes,
and that's a function of Chapter 12 of the Constitution and the Public Finance Management Act.
Okay.
And I think the important thing for investors is you have to understand that process, because there are multiple points in which you can get involved, even as a sector body, so people like CAM, or as an individual company. You can make your own comments, you can make your own submissions, you can talk to legislators. So it's not just a process that happens
one-off.
It's an ongoing process that you can actually influence if you need to.
Okay, what about banking sector?
So the banking sector is governed by the Finance Committee
Okay.
in the National Assembly, who also oversee people like Central Bank, CMA, and various other regulators in the space. And any amendments to legislation in that space, such as the Banking Act, the SACCOs Act, the Microfinance Act, have to come through them.
Okay.
And then they can also do investigations and write reports. So they're pretty important to the financial sector. And the rate cap, for instance, had to pass through that committee first.
All right.
So if there's any significant legislative changes that you as a sector want to be watching, or you as an investor or a broker want to be watching, it's a good idea just to keep an eye on what the committees relevant to you are currently working on.
Okay.
Then you know what may come down the line.
So it's important to look out for the order of proceedings as well as the upcoming bills and the bill tracker on the parliamentary website, just for you to be attuned to anything and not get any surprises.
Yeah.
And then finally, my last question on the legislative process. What is the interplay between the Senate and the Parliament? And if there's a bill, for instance, we're talking about the telecom industry. If the Senate has a divergent view from the Parliament, who has the order of who has the final say with regards to telecoms, for instance?
Well, I'll tell you when the courts tell us, because they're currently in court trying to sort out that exact question.
Okay.
Yeah. And the wording is ambiguous in the Constitution, hence the confusion between when exactly can the Senate get involved and when can't they. And they're currently litigating that. So I'll tell you when I know, which is when the court tells us.
Okay. Yeah, and that's an interesting one. They've actually gone to court for an interpretation. Let's see how that goes. But Eugene, I've got a question around the financial sector matters legislation. And something came out last year during the Finance Act 2018 debate. And I think the whole point of Finance Act bill as a bill is for the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, to Treasury rather, is tables out his taxation measures and how he wants to finance that huge budget. He outlines all those things in a finance bill. Parliament debates, right? Now we have a situation where the finance bill has so many miscellaneous amendments, and most of them relating to the financial services sector. All those amendments, insurance sector, banking sector amendments, RBA, CMA. These amendments, and we saw it last year, they tend to hold the finance bill hostage in Parliament, because last year we saw the President return back the bill on not matters contained in the act, the core matters of the finance bill, but on the miscellaneous amendments. Don't you think, and I wrote about that, don't you think that it's time that we freed up finance bill from all those miscellaneous amendments?
Well, the problem is that the finance bill is essentially an amendment act every single year.
Yeah.
Rather than rewriting our tax law every single year, it's just much easier to pass an amendment act to tweak around the edges depending on what government intends to do in that specific budget cycle. Where you tend to get into problems is where you get controversial taxes. So last year it was the fuel taxes.
Yeah.
And obviously MPs got pressure from their constituents around fuel taxes.
Yeah.
You saw that happen with betting taxes a bit as well, where MPs cut the amount the government wanted to charge, and of course the rate cap.
Yeah.
Government tried to pass a repeal of the rate cap through the finance bill, and Parliament said no. So yes, there's usually within the finance bill 2 or 3 things where there's a bit of disagreement.
Actually, there are not even 2 or 3, Eugene. There are many of them. Look at for Finance Bill 2019. You're going to see a lot of miscellaneous amendments. Don't you think if it's a CMA amendment to the CMA Act, or it's amendment to the Insurance Regulatory, to the Insurance Act, could they just have a separate Insurance Act amendment bill?
So there's 2 acts that pass, which a lot of people tend to confuse. One is the finance bill, and that amends tax laws. So if it has a tax implication, it goes in the finance bill. Then there's something else called the miscellaneous statute amendments bill, which amends various other laws, but don't have a tax implication. So sometimes government wants to tweak an insurance regulation or a banking regulation that doesn't necessarily have an excise tax tied to it or VAT tied to it. It can do that through the Miscellaneous Amendments Act. So you get these 2 acts, and I agree, they're very confusing to read and very hard to understand for non-lawyers too, because you have to read a clause and then go back to the original act and see what it's trying to amend.
I always do that.
So this political process, gentlemen, I can understand how we're looking at the Constitution and what needs to be done. I'll take us back to the finance bill last year. So initially, the proposal was let's repeal it, and then there was a conversation that started on the bill was presented on a Thursday, and then the first debate or the first reading was actually done on a Friday, and then they picked it up the next week on a Monday. And I remember watching it, and some of the MPs came and said, we don't want the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank telling us what we need to do. We don't need rate caps in Nairobi. And of course at 6 it ends in that conversation. It tapered down. So of course on Monday I'm expecting that the same MP is going to come with the conversation of, you know what I was saying, the conversation changed on Monday. I don't know what politics happened. And that's the element I'm trying to capture, because now on that Monday, of course that MP who closed on Friday was called back on Monday. He was the person who was starting off the session. And his conversation was, ladies and gentlemen, this rate cap, his conversation, he didn't touch on IMF, he didn't touch on Bretton Woods, he didn't touch on anything. In the same session when they were taking the vote, and we all watched this, it was almost a fight, because there was the numbers kept tweaking as the process went through. Some of the opposition MPs came and said, this rate cap, we think it's a good thing. The banks have made money, then why do we have it? And then a few seconds, everybody booed him and is like, well, what I meant to say. It's a subtle thing, but I just want us to get to the crux of this matter. Politics. Because by the time an MP changes his tone from a harsh tone to this is okay, this is what is happening, who controls that conversation? Is it the head of business from the majority party? Are there other undertones that actually dictate how policy is made? Because I can completely appreciate this element of the Constitution says this, but then how do we begin to understand these undertones, and what do we pay attention to?
And just to add on to her question, which is a very important question, is the accountability aspect of Parliament. You know, one of the debates that have come out of late is that Parliament is not exercising its oversight role, especially in as far as controlling the state's expenditure. Parliament actually has powers to actually cap things like expenditures and borrowings, and we don't see them doing this. You know, we're almost running away with
the political undertone. Then we can come to the fiscal, if you don't mind.
So, beyond the formal legislative process that's outlined in the Constitution and the standing orders, is of course this politics that goes on behind the scenes. People are having conversations, and often in committee rooms, a lot of times will be a negotiation between the committee and the ministry that's trying to push this particular bill to try and get it passed, and sometimes State House gets involved because it's part of their national agenda and they want to get it passed.
Is it Chief of Staff, State House, or is it?
Sometimes it's the Chief of Staff, sometimes it's the President, sometimes it's the Solicitor General. It really depends on the bill. It really depends on how important it is and who it is important to. And then there's a political process, and understanding it requires understanding the interests behind that bill, the political motivations for that bill, the policy reasons for that bill, and then you'll get to understand who's involved and where these tracks of influence may be coming from.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Thank you for those 4 pointers, because I think as an analyst, more often than not, you tend to forget the political element on any investment decision that you make. And this is something that caught most people off guard, especially the first time the rate cap happened. Largely because that conversation had started earlier on, but then you're like, oh, this is politics, we'll have our way. But I think that's something that somebody needs to incorporate in their own evaluation and say, I'll probably give politics 10% in my valuation model, or even 5%, just to cater for some of these nuances that you don't.
Yeah. And don't forget, it's not just legislation that can have an impact. These parliamentary committees have the ability to start investigations and do reports.
Very true.
And you've seen it a couple of times where a parliamentary committee kicks off a report that has an impact on the markets, whether it's into fertilizer, whether it's into should Safaricom be broken up, for instance? That was a topic of conversation a few years ago.
It's back again. What do you think? Because it has been sponsored by the GMMP. So is that coming from the ministry? Who is it coming from? And what are the nuances on that one?
Yes, so you see, this is one of the ways where there's interplay between these things, in terms of you have a certain view from certain quarters that maybe gets some traction in Parliament, and someone suggests something on the floor, and then you'll have pushback from the ministry and CAK and Safaricom themselves that this is a bad idea, this is terrible. So it's multiple people involved and multiple interests involved. And
what bet, like if you're saying, is there a high chance of this telecom bill that says split Safaricom from M-Pesa, split Airtel from its Airtel money? Do you think that happens? Do you place a 5% chance of this conversation going? Do you place a 50% chance of this conversation ongoing? Just from your own political assessment.
At this point in time, I don't think so.
Okay.
And I think the only way it happens is if Safaricom themselves want it.
If Safaricom want it. So we can still keep looking at Safaricom. Thank you very much.
So it's essentially is alluding to the power of corporate lobby, right? Corporate lobby, yeah.
Oh.
Anyway, fine. Let's talk energy sector. What's your view, what's your assessment of the energy sector policies so far in Kenya? Do you think they're very inhibitive, or have they encouraged investment in the sector?
So, like the overall fiscal policy, so far it's been a bit confused and convoluted in terms of it's really structured around the core goals are accessibility, so everyone should be able to access electricity, reliability, stability, and affordability for both household consumers like you and I, as well as industry. Now, the problems with implementing that have been numerous in terms of the implementation issues, in terms of something like the 5,000 megawatts program, which was maybe a bit too ambitious, finding the funding for that, having the right policies in place. So it's been a bit convoluted. But I would say, going back to the legislation conversation, the Energy Act of 2019 is actually a very interesting piece of legislation, because it has the potential to make Kenya a real innovator in the energy space.
Really?
In the things that it allows. So one of the things it allows is feed-in tariffs. I don't know whether you've seen this in Germany, where you can have your solar panels on your roof, and if you produce too much energy, you can sell it back into the grid. That's contained in the bill, and that'll allow things like microgrids and mini grids, as well as home solar, to play a much bigger role on the energy scene.
That's very interesting.
That's coupled with something like, it allows for demonopolization of transmission and selling of power. So we could find ourselves in a situation where Kenya Power is not the only energy company on the scene, and they're having to compete and improve against a different player in the market. So there's a lot of potential there.
Eugene, let me interject just on that particular element of changing the structure. So if you actually look at the energy sector, maybe a decade, about 15 years ago, it's the IMF and the World Bank that said it's an inefficient structure. We think just, create one institution that is focused on distribution, another one that is focused on transmission, just to enhance the efficiency. So sometimes we have all these plans where we are last mile connectivity is a focus, reducing the transmission losses at not Ketrako, Kengen level, as well as at KPLC level. They were all coming off the Bretton Woods institutions that were trying to get a sense and put a framework for this for the energy sector to work. Then now today we have this energy bill that wants to transform it. So is that then aligned to where we were coming from 10 years ago, or has the vision changed? And then who would be actually pushing this agenda to get the monopoly away from the likes of KPLC and Ketrako?
So it does align with where we're coming from in terms of, so what we saw 10, 15 years ago with the split of the old KPLC into the three, Ketraco, Kengen and Kenya Power, around transmission, distribution and generation, is something that happened pretty early in the Kibaki administration, in terms of they recognized the inefficiency of what was in place. And that came along certain policies like feed-in tariffs and PPAs, where you see people get guaranteed rates for having electricity. So that was supposed to kick the energy sector into dealing with the generation gap we had and starting to get some reliability and stability back into the grid.
Okay. Wow.
So where we are now is at that phase where we actually produce more power than we demand at peak.
That's true.
We have much improved stability. Yes, I know we still have power cuts, but we're in a much better place than many other countries on the continent. So we're looking at a situation, and we're in a changing context, right, in terms of big baseload power stations aren't the only way of generating power anymore. You've got much more renewable power coming onto the grid. We're in a regional grid now. We're connected to Uganda and Tanzania and Ethiopia, so it's a different context as well.
Yeah, let's talk baseload actually.
Actually, that's
Do you think the renewables are a good source of baseload?
In Kenya's case, absolutely. Because if you look at our specific renewables, particularly geothermal, doesn't have the intermittency problem that solar does. And if you look at and Lake Turkana as well is actually quite a unique wind power project, because its efficiency is much higher than most similar wind projects around the world. And we have about 8 to 10,000 megawatts of geothermal potential. So we have the ability to produce clean, renewable baseload power at a massive scale, which is not an opportunity that's open to every country, but it's also one of the things that's driving a bit of the reticence behind, say, Lamu coal, in terms of why are we building a coal plant when we have all this renewable energy available to us.
But how's globally? I mean, you've looked at some of the global best practice rather. How have countries managed to douse the high rates of transmission losses? We are doing 20% today in Kenya. That's very high.
20% is high. It's higher than the average.
Oh, really?
Yes. It's if you compare us to our peers on the continent, so people such as South Africa and Egypt, it's higher than that.
Oh no, but I don't think that's a fair comparative. You need to focus as to say
to
Nigeria.
Actually, Nigeria should be much lower than 20%.
Nigeria is much worse.
Much worse than we are. But I mean, very interesting.
But to be fair, we've improved. It was up around the 30% rate, 10, 15 years ago, and we've improved.
We have improved, but we have to end it here. Maybe we can have another in-depth conversation and focus on the energy sector. But what is your end shot in terms of when you're looking at politics, when you're looking at the economy? What's of importance for you today as an investor?
As an investor, I'd say three things. One is the political stability. So if, for instance, we get something like a referendum around the corner, that'll have a massive impact on the political stability and thus the willingness of investors to invest in Kenya and the willingness of companies to spend money, and even households to spend money. I'd say the second thing is the fiscal picture, in terms of, as I said earlier, government is the biggest spender in the economy and the biggest employer in the economy. And if debt really does start to drag on government, it will drag on the economy. And then the third aspect is, of course, the 2022 elections. They are far away enough that some people think we don't have to worry about them, but they're close enough that some people are worrying about them. And it's something that you're going to have to factor into your thinking as an analyst or a broker or an investor or a business much more and more as we start getting closer to it.
Perfect end to it. I don't know if you want to add anything, George.
Let's get the politicians out of the way.
That's not happening. But there you have it. A few pointers on what you need to look out for. But remember what we have said. On Safaricom, the greatest legislation risk that they have is whether to split M-Pesa or to leave the company as it is. Very low chance of that happening. That aside, look out for the election cycle that's just already getting momentum. And most importantly, what happens in the referendum. We cannot get away from the politicians, but we can find a way to actually keep tabs on what they're doing and make better investment decisions. You had it here from us at Markets Today. Look out for the market highlights. See you again tomorrow at 9 a.m.